So actually we're moving on now to an hour spent with Lara, one of our colleagues at CSER, whose work has been mentioned, I think, possibly more than anyone else's in the last 2 days. And the very map that SJ showed of volcanic risk does come from Lara's work. But actually it's another aspect of it that we're going to hear about today. So Lara is a research associate at CSER, and she works on understanding how to improve knowledge of global risk to increase our ability to turn that into action. So on the communication and action that comes from this greater analysis. And her PhD evaluated the effectiveness of using video games to understand volcanic hazards and to educate people in the Eastern Caribbean about them. And we've heard a lot more in the last 2 days about her wider work on volcanoes and those risks. But now we're hearing a little bit more in 45 minutes or so, or for 45 minutes or so, from Lara on what works for global catastrophic risk communication, how to actually get from that place of analysis to action. So Lara, I'll give you the stage for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions, finishing at 11:15. The floor is yours, and your presentation is there.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jess, for the introduction. And yeah, it's a bit overwhelming what I'm learning is I evidently work too hard and I need to take some holiday. So expect an annual leave request from me soon. So yeah, I'm switching more towards my communication work that I've been trying to think about a bit at CSER over the last couple of years. In my head, I'm devastated to present this to you now because in 6 months' time, I know it'll be a million times better because obviously some of these bits and bobs are still in progress as we're going through the project. So I'm going to try and draw some very basic conclusions, but I hope that I'll be able to share some of those later as we go through this project. So just kind of very briefly on what I'm going to be talking about, just going to give you a very whistle-stop tour of how we're communicating about global catastrophic risk, what are the challenges of those communications, the methods and tools that we can use, and learning from real-time crises as well. So how are we currently communicating? And this, when I say we, I mean the field of existential risk, global catastrophic risk, and us as CSER as well, and many of the other organisations that are also within this room. And I can't start anywhere else but the Doomsday Clock, and of course the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So the Doomsday Clock, as many of you know, each year it's announced at the end of January how close we are to the apocalypse in a time sequence. And we are currently 100 seconds to midnight, which is the closest. I'm just going to look for some nods in the room. I think it's the closest we've ever been to midnight. And ultimate doom. Of course, it's an artistic piece. It's not a technical piece. There is no calculation behind how they, it's decided by a committee. But what's so brilliant about both the Doomsday Clock and the Bulletin are they've been going for over 75 years. They remain relevant today. People still listen to the announcements. It's got an amazing readership of the Bulletin of over 35 million people per year. And that is a predominantly young audience, which is obviously that one that's really difficult to capture in communications. And when they do that announcement, of course, they have incredibly famous people that stand, Mary Robinson and Ban Ki-moon and Jerry Brown. And it just gets covered by global media all over the world. So this is something we're doing that's getting a bit of attention. But what else are we doing? And there's going to be a few shout-outs here for some people that I think are doing some great stuff. So FLI, and we've got Gigi with us this week from the Future of Life, and they've been doing, they have a mandate of outreach and policy work, and they've their films of slaughterbots, and their most recent one that came out last year? December. Slaughterbots Kill. And these have got massive viewership online, millions of views of these. So kind of these short films about lethal autonomous weapons. And Shahar, a few years ago, managed to develop a module for Civilization 5 on superintelligence into the gaming space and expanding into thinking about how we can introduce some of the themes of existential risk into existing communications. Probably one of the most popular right now is obviously Toby Ward's book and The Precipice, and it's just one of many. We've got a million books in this field, and as we're all dying for the grand futures. Can we just, but including things, Martin Rees's wonderful books on our final century, and all of those wonderful pieces of literature that we've produced. Back to FLI as well, and the Future of Life Award, another one, a wonderful example of of celebrating people within the field of existential risk that have made a substantial contribution to humanity. And I think this is Petrov's family. Is that right? Yeah. Looking at Gigi, yeah, Petrov's family, the chap that managed to save us all from a nuclear war. So, yeah, we're doing loads of stuff. I mean, I could show you a million examples of things we're doing. And all of us are doing something. There's podcasts, op-eds, books, articles, short films, game modules, awards. But my big question is, but this is all great, but what's the impact of what you're doing? And this is something that I've been reflecting on a little bit since I joined CSER. And it's very much what I'm interested in understanding is understanding how what the impact is of our communications and what we're able to achieve through them. And why does impact matter? Well, how would you feel if you received this? Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. And this was a text message that was sent a few years ago by accident during a scenario training exercise to all residents in Hawaii. It took 38 minutes to cancel this message. And in that time, there's some wonderful things on Twitter if you want to read more about what people did. They went to go and view the ocean for the last time. They drank with strangers in supermarkets. They did all sorts of wonderful things. But the point is that if ever we need people to take action to anything or take any of our messaging seriously, we've got to make sure that the communications we do are effective. So what does successful communication look like? Well, if you know the answer, then you can have my job. We're still working on this, but it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So you need to, not every communication should be the same. So it depends on why you're communicating, who you're communicating to. So who is that audience? Who are you trying to make the messages reach? How are you communicating? What methods, tools, and techniques? And what would you like to happen as a result? What is that impact that you're trying to achieve as a result of your communications? And so when I talk about communications, I guess I have a model, and for some reason I drew it as a triangle, and perhaps it's not a triangle, but it just felt like that was the right thing to draw. And I tend to kind of think of two key audiences and two models for communication. One is that you can communicate to mass publics, and what the mechanism for change would be is by in kind of promoting some kind of activism in which people seek change of decision makers. And possibly the best example of that's probably climate change, but also, you know, around things like microplastics and straws that, you know, we heard yesterday were banned. The other model is to just skip ahead of that step and go in more at the policy and decision makers and just try to affect change at that level. And the reason that I think there are two different ones is because some messages match audiences differently. So the messages that you're going to make for policymakers, for example, might not be at all relevant to the general public. So things around, for example, the governance of AI. Do we really need the general public to know the detailed ins and outs of how we need to govern AI? Perhaps later when the systems are in place and we understand how to do that. But right now, possibly not. Rather, there's things that what we're trying to do is kind of get on the public communications, is communicate in a way in which we can get them to take their own actions towards mitigation resilience. So pandemic preparedness, for example, when the pandemic came around, we wanted the public to take actions. So you're tailoring your messages to match to fit. So my big question is, should everyone care about global catastrophic risk? And I certainly don't think so. I don't think everyone needs to be awake at night for the rest of their lives, just in case. But it's, you know, thinking about how we tailor those messages to get the right kind of effect that we need. So what does impact look like? Okay, the jury's still out, but I'm going to try. And Caesareans will recognize this term. I like to ask it to them regularly. But what's your BHAG, which is your big, hairy, audacious goal? So if the sky was the limit, what is it that you want to achieve from what you're doing with your communications? So whenever you're designing communications or you want to go in this world, I want you to think of your BHAG. And what might impact look like? Well, maybe we want to increase the resilience of publics towards certain risks. So how could we achieve that? We could motivate societies to take precautionary measures. So we're thinking about the impact, which we may or not be able to necessarily reach. I mean, how can we possibly, you know, understand that we've increased the resilience of all of publics towards certain risks? We might not be able to ever achieve that. In your BHAG, you might not ever be able to prove, but what you can certainly prove is your outcomes. And we're talking about theory of change here, of course. And so if we can measure distance change within our outcomes, which we're saying is, motivating societies to take precautions, and we might see societies adopting more precautionary measures towards certain risks, or we might realise that there's an increased knowledge and understanding of those risks, people talking about them and them appearing in kind of more societal cultures, then we can start to infer that we're working towards the increasing resilience of publics. Or, for example, on the policy, or on the kind of more policy angle, maybe want to actually reduce that risk entirely. And the outcomes might be seeing an increased spending on preparedness towards those risks, an increased adoption of policies towards risk reduction, and an increased action towards mitigation and prevention of the risks directly. So it's thinking about those models of what you're trying to achieve when you come to communicate. And the reason that this is so important is a lesson that I take from disaster risk, and that is you might only ever have the chance to engage that person once in their life with this information that you want them to take seriously. So shouldn't we make sure that the way in which we communicate is effective? Okay, the challenges. I made it sound really simple, but of course it isn't. And there are many challenges. People struggle to think about the long term. And there's been a lot of kind of discussions around how we can communicate long term and using the terminology of future generations and getting people to think more like that as a way of thinking about the long term. But it is incredibly difficult to get people to understand what long-term thinking is, particularly when there might be something in their lives that is more prescient or important to them. So if your garden floods every year, are you really going to vote for the politician that says, I want to deflect asteroids? No, likely not. Uncertainty, and I'm really nervous mentioning uncertainty with an expert in the room, so definitely Sarah Dryhurst with us, and she focuses on communication of uncertainty, so definitely track her down and chat about this more. But uncertainty is absolutely inherent in global catastrophic risk, and it's incredibly difficult for a lot of people to understand and for communicators to communicate effectively. So I'm only going to really lightly touch on that one and skip over it quickly. And numbers are also super difficult to understand anyway, whether it's uncertainty or not, but just general numbers and visualization of risk. And we heard recently from Paul and Scott Slovic, who came and gave us a public seminar on dealing with this kind of cognitive bias that we have around numbers. And the other thing is that people don't see impact towards global catastrophic risk mitigation. And I think Sean once said, the director of the centre, said, if CSER's done its job well, you won't even know we did anything at all. And that's kind of the problem when it comes to communication, because people can't see what you're doing. So therefore, it becomes unseeable, it becomes a lower priority in their lives. Unseen risks as well. And so a lot of the risks we're talking about are not that easy to visualize. They're not that easy to see and understand. And I've put the turtle. I remember was sat next to me yesterday, I was Googling turtles with straws up their nose, and they were a bit too gruesome. So I found a nice one. It was not nice, it's a turtle eating a plastic bag. But the point is that we love turtles, right? And we're seeing this turtle swimming and it's eating a bag, and we're upset by that. And we make the link that humans are putting plastic into the ocean and it's damaging wildlife. But the problem isn't actually perhaps the bag. And in fact, there are worse problems than microplastics. I'm not a basher of microplastics, but I just think there are other risks that are a little bit more important. And I'm going to just say that my partner is an environmental chemist, and he's always banging on about this, so it's made it into my talk. But he actually focuses on persistent pollutants in the environment. And PCBs, we're finding them at the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the deepest parts of our ocean. These are man-made pollutants in our environments. But we don't hear about that because we don't see it. We don't see the visuals of a turtle eating a plastic bag or a turtle eating PCBs. So therefore, we just ignore it and we just don't work towards those risks. So this is one of the biggest problems overcoming in kind of communication work. The fear factor. It might be a sexy science, but it's awfully terrifying for many. And I know when I joined the field, I was like, oh my God, this is terrifying. And I was listening to all sorts of podcasts and having all terrible dreams. But that's not what we want to do with our audience. We don't want them to feel like that, right? So, and the problem with fear is if you're communicating in a way that you are promoting fear or invoking fear in somebody, that can actually have the opposite effect of what you want to do. And it can actually lead to inaction, like immobilizing somebody towards being able to deal with that risk. So what can we do? And Gigi and I have chatted a little bit about this, and I'm hoping that we can continue working down these roads. But certainly developing messages of hope, and that's kind of building on Toby Ord and Owen Cotton Barrett's work on existential hope. And using hopeful messages, positive messages, discussing around the positive benefits of AI, how that could transform our lives, as well as talking about the risks. So having that balance in the way in which we communicate. And you know, there's some wonderful work coming from FLI and the Foresight Institute on existential hope. Designing messages to empower, solution-based messaging. And this is very much what we saw in COVID. It was around washing your hands to the birthday song, wearing face masks, and doing all these things that you as a person and an individual could do to reduce the risk of the pandemic. So developing these empowering messages and solution-based messaging is also a good way to overcome fear. Okay, so a bit more onto about the tools and methods that I've been exploring and looking at whilst during my time at CSER. And I'm going to start just by talking about experiential learning. And I'm sure a lot of you in the room are probably aware of experiential learning. So this is a pedagogy from Kolb. And basically, it's learning through doing. So having a concrete experience which you can then reflect on and develop in yourself to then apply those techniques and skills yourself. And why I focus a lot about this, and this kind of started during my PhD, is there's nothing more solid than actually experiencing something and taking the lessons from that to switch from extrinsic motivations to intrinsic motivations, which ultimately can lead to action. So this is going to be underpinning a lot of the work has been underpinning a lot of the work that I've been doing in the centre. And just to put that into context, think about an event that means a lot to you in your life. Maybe your wedding day, maybe a memorable birthday, maybe an amazing holiday you had. You'll find that these memories are much more vivid in your mind because they're strongly emotive. They're days and events in your life that meant a lot to you, and they actually store in a better way. So if you can kind of create this emotional response in people around communication of risk, you can effectively have the same response, that people retain that information in the longer run. So on to scenarios, and Luke did a wonderful kind of introduction for me yesterday, thanks Luke, as to scenarios, and many of you in this room actually attended the scenarios workshop earlier this year that we were held here at CSER, so you might see your faces coming. So basically scenario exercises are these immersive experiences where you can use with stakeholders, disaster responders, whoever your audience is, to demonstrate to them what it is to live through that crisis or that experience. So they're currently being used really broadly across global catastrophic risk, all the way from planetary defense to bio risks, all the way, to food disaster risks, all different risks, all different environments. And there's a couple of examples here, and the top one is from Johns Hopkins and the Center for Health Security, and that's their Clade X scenario. They do very large-scale, high-budget, like $1 million budget scenario exercises with extremely elite-level stakeholders, such as members of the White House. They hire in actors, they do all this wonderful stuff. It's quite mind-boggling to kind of get this really highly immersive experience for these stakeholders to build a resilience into their systems. And the bottom one is from the Planetary Defense Conference, the International Academy of Astronautics, which was last year. And they do one every other year, but they also run them with elite level stakeholders too, from NASA and FEMA. And they simulate an asteroid impact somewhere in the world. And this one was, from the conference last year, and it struck Central Europe across a kind of multiple borders and boundaries. And I think the population impact was about 6 million. So I mean, the point of scenario exercises is to get people to experience those risks themselves, but also to stress test how you're going to respond. And so they can be extremely powerful in kind of in this mechanism. So as I mentioned back in March, we did a workshop here in CSER, and as I say, many of you were able to attend, and we were exploring what works for scenarios, but all doing them in silos. But what actually works? What are we finding is being useful in exploring those things, in exploring using scenarios for global catastrophic risk? So we heard all sorts of wonderful things. Gordon and his counterfactual analysis, which is just wonderful, and I might be stealing some of that later. We heard from Caroline Bailon and her work with the APPG using matrices. We heard from the OECD and Longview Philanthropy on their use of scenarios for existential risk. We heard from L.A. Lewis, who works at FEMA on his planetary defense scenarios he'd run with the White House. And then we heard from Eric Toner from the Centre for Health Security at Johns Hopkins, and many others. There was many, many people and wonderful talks. And we also heard from Joachim that was here with us yesterday. So we're actually putting a report together when I find some time. Yeah, we hope to be kind of sharing that soon about the lessons and the kind of things that we took from those 2 days of engagement with each other. And also some scenarios that we're doing at CSER. And of course, Shahar, if you were here yesterday, spoke about intelligence rising. And so I won't rehash the wheel, but for those that may be joining online that weren't able to be there yesterday, Intelligence Rising is a role-playing game that we use at CSER, and it basically is for exploring possible futures in AI. And the concept is that participants play as either a country actor or they play as the head of a company, and they try to develop AI technologies. We've currently used this with a range of audiences, from students to people that work in AI tech companies, from the EA community, all sorts of different people. And what's really wonderful about this is we actually ask people to embody that character and try to think in the way of in which that actor would kind of think about risk and think about how to work through this imaginary world. So we end up developing a kind of a possible future in AI. Yeah, basically it's the point is kind of twofold. There's one, to give them the experience, but there's also an element of education as well, because some people that come to play Intelligence Rising maybe don't know that much about AI at all. And then the other one that we have been exploring most recently, and we're super grateful to have Rick Davies in the room, who's the creator of this method. And this is called PartEvo, and it's a participatory evolution method. And it's a narrative-based story development tool. And essentially, you start with a seed story, and then you ask people through iterations to add a kind of snippet of storyline to each of those iterations. And then what you end up with is a whole range of different possible futures and pathways. So we've been using this quite recently with Tom Hobson to explore possible futures for the governance of biosecurity research with elite level stakeholders in the field. And it's just been so wonderful. It's so engaging. We get a really good response rate, and all of these really vivid, beautiful narratives and storylines that develop through that method. So one of the things I'm most interested in, though, and it's the title of my talk, is what works for communication. And so I've been evaluating both of these methods over the last 2 years, both Intelligence Rising and both PartEvo. And one of the questions that I ask, and I'm in the process of doing the data analysis, so I hope to be able to share some more deeper reflections. But for now, one of the questions that I ask is, how much did you enjoy playing or engaging in the exercise? And how realistic did you find the futures? And I noticed, and I'm going to, there's only one data set here, so replicability will come. But for now, what we kind of see is this general positive trend that as the level of realism increases, so too does the level of enjoyment. And why is that important? Well, that's the foundations of game theory. So if you, the more that you find that you enjoy something, and the more realistic that you find the engagement, the more likely you are to increase your knowledge, and the more likely you are to have longer term impacts and behavioral changes. So this kind of links quite a lot to what we were saying about the experiential learning and learning through doing, and the fact that if you can invoke this kind of active participation in people that engage with your activities, that you can result in increased impact in the long run. Okay, creative communications, and I'm a bit scared about talking about this after Pablo yesterday. I mean, hard act to follow. So humour, creativity and fun. So Jess gave me a wonderful introduction there and mentioned my PhD research. And it links in here. So actually I haven't shared this for many years. Like, what did I do? But yeah, basically my PhD was around using video games to communicate with at-risk communities in the Caribbean. And this is a picture from the game that we created. And the point was, so we worked with the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean, which many of you know that I've worked on for a long time. And basically, the volcano sat quiet for 40 years. And in the meantime, those populations are exposed to hurricanes, they're exposed to dengue, other hazards and risks in their environment that happen on a much more frequent basis. Meanwhile, the volcano sits quietly in the background. So how can you get people to engage in information that is vital, potentially in the future, in the short distant future, when it's not a prescient risk right now? So we attempted to use video games, and we used that with about 1,500 children across the island as part of, we've got Stacey with us today, as part of their education and outreach program at the University of the West Indies. And it was pretty successful. I need to reread my thesis, but basically, yeah, it was pretty successful, but we'll come on to this in a bit more later, but you have to have context in the way in which you do communication. So just posting out a game onto social media and saying, play this game, will never work unless people understand why and what the lessons are and the underpinning of the pedagogy that's going to support those kind of communications and what you're doing. And that was kind of what we found, is like the game is really successful when you have outreach people that go with it and kind of put it into a kind of scaffolding around that session. But what we did notice is that it really promoted this active engagement that I've talked about as PAR-EVO and both Intelligence Rising do, that can lead to the longer-term memory retention and learning gains. So I mentioned our talk recently from both Paul and Scott Slovic, and I'm pinching this from them because it's so wonderful. And the other thing is about how we visualize risk and think about numbers. And so the example on the left is, of course, is the ceramic poppy display that they did outside the Tower of London, which every single ceramic poppy represented a death in World War I. And this was just a really wonderful way of getting people to see numbers and risk. If there's Paul and Scott say this classic thing of like, is 6 deaths different to 7 deaths in your head? And actually, there's a point in which you stop to think about what those numbers mean. And so how can we talk and visualize those risks? And art is definitely a way to do that. The one on the right I also swiped from Seismic, which I just thought was brilliant on their Twitter page, which is one from the Tohoku earthquake in Japan. And this is a poster on the side of the Samsung building in Tokyo. And of course, Tokyo is a major city, right? There's 10 million people living in Tokyo. And the problem is when we start to live like that, we start to disengage with our environment, and we don't seem to understand how we engage in those places that we live. And so they put this poster up, and where the red line is on that poster is the height of the tsunami wave. So right in the heart of Tokyo, they could visualize what that meant to have a 10-meter high wave, which I just thought was a really wonderful way of communicating that risk. And so one of the problems with global catastrophic risks was, well, maybe arguably we've perhaps experienced some global catastrophic risks, but existential we definitely haven't. We're still here. So how can we, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is how we can kind of draw lessons from real-time crises to inform our work on global catastrophic risk communication. And obviously I can't not talk about COVID. And I'm going to admit that I've been fairly negligent of COVID because I just there's a lot of people there, there's a lot of people looking at it. I don't need to kind of put into that mix. There's other areas I can focus. But I've drawn a few things that I wanted to kind of pull from COVID that I think are pretty salient to global catastrophic risk communication. And the first is transparency. And this is Patrick Valance. Is it? I don't know when it was. I was in France. So, he basically on the 17th of March said to the Commons Health Committee that COVID should die down in 2 to 3 weeks. And of course, a week later, we were in lockdown in the UK. So transparency of information. What do you know? What don't you know? And understanding like where to draw the line in what you're communicating and what you're saying. Accessibility of information, and I had a bit of I was on my high horse about this a little bit over COVID. Just because it's a crisis, it doesn't mean that you should ignore people from information. You should leave them out. And certainly we saw that time and time again with COVID. Sometimes there was not a British Sign Language person available in the conference rooms, and that just means that you're missing key groups of people that deserve to also hear that information. So making sure that our information remains accessible. the public. And I like to adopt the STS term of publics because, of course, I mean, even just within this room, we're a bunch of different people with different beliefs, different values, and different thoughts. So we're not the public. We are many different publics of people. And one of the things for me, I think, was on the positive side is just how powerful the publics can be. And I dare to say that they did anything right, but one of the things that they did do right, in my personal opinion, is at the beginning, when there was quite a lot of uncertainty around what to do, is the empowering messages that they put around washing hands. And we all had Tina Turner singing "I Will Survive" to washing hands. We had Boris Johnson singing the birthday song. Everyone was out washing their hands, doing whatever, because that was this method of empowering that person to give them the information on how to take their own protective action. But also, like, we shouldn't underestimate the power of publics. They are important. They are able to make change. And I think often the power of publics was kind of ignored by the government. And I also can't talk about COVID without talking about this castle visit. Dominic Cummings and his castle holiday. I think personally a key moment in the pandemic in the UK crisis about when we realised that there was a major loss of trust in the government and how important it is to make sure that you're sustaining trust. So I think that was a major point of undermining during the pandemic crisis. So now I'm going to talk about another project that I've been working on with Stacey Edwards. He's joined us from the Seismic Research Centre all the way from Trinidad. And this is where I also worked on my PhD with a video game. So St Vincent and the Grenadines is an island in the Lesser Antilles. And as I mentioned earlier, the volcano had stayed quiet for 42 years. At the end of December 2020, she decided it was time to show signs of life. And this lava dome, so you can see in this picture that black kind of dome is what we call a lava dome. So it's an extrusion of lava within the summit crater, kind of appeared. It continued to grow for 5 months into this slug. And then on the 9th of April, the volcano went explosive. I think Stacey and I probably never wanted to see these photos. And I think that kind of thought about, how I felt seeing these photos that day will stay with me forever. Having spent a lot of time on this island working with communities and stakeholders in the preparation of such a disaster, it was quite shocking to see. Between the period of the 9th and the 22nd of April, there was 32 discrete explosive events, so the explosion of those ash plumes. And the impact was 18,000 people evacuated to emergency shelters, with substantial loss and damages to the agricultural land and a cleanup of about 28 million Caribbean dollars. So last year, Stacey and I began chatting, and Stacey and her team at the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Centre were responsible for all of the crisis communications campaign during the eruption. So that was radio broadcasts, that was doing community outreach, that was doing all sorts of social media things, and it was a pandemic, guys. So we couldn't go to Ireland, we couldn't travel. There was all these things that just meant that changed the entire situation of anything we'd ever thought. And this is a whole story, and this is a whole side of another story. So I'm going to keep this on the global catastrophic risk strain, and I'm happy we've done an extensive evaluation of that crisis communications campaign. But what I want to reflect on here is what we can learn from our experience of this eruption for global catastrophic risk communication specifically. And so that's myself, Stacey, and our colleague Leah, who's just arrived in St Vincent today. We have a film coming out on Friday, so watch your social medias. And she's taking it on a Caribbean community island tour. So that's the team that worked on this. And what I was interested in reflecting on our experience of this for GCRs is how can we make sure that information is accessible, what works for communicating risk, what were the challenges, and how does information flow in communities? So last summer we went out on a data collection campaign. We did an online and in-person survey. We visited hundreds of people living in shelters, emergency shelters who were still living there. We did community focus groups, and we spoke to stakeholders of all sorts of backgrounds and environments across the island. And some reflections on going through this kind of campaign of evaluation is the importance of trusted and influential voices. And we had a little bit of a discussion about that yesterday with Luke's talk. And using the key voices, and of course Martin reflected on that too. During the communications campaign, one of the lead scientists, Professor Richie Robertson, is a Vincentian. He's from St Vincent, and I think we think that was pretty influential in people taking those messages and voices seriously, but not only just having one familiar face and person, but also having a group and team of people from the Caribbean region in general. So the team from Trinidad being the faces and the voices that people were able to listen to regularly. And they did regular broadcasts every single morning. There was one of the lead scientists and one of the team from Trinidad was on the radio with the Prime Minister talking about what was happening at the volcano. And many of the people that we spoke to said this became a kind of source of comfort for many that were evacuated. And kind of if you think about your COVID experience, I never watched telly, but I always watched, I was in France, I always watched Emmanuel Macron's speeches because it was like that one key thing that we had, those regular communications of those press conferences in the evening that just kept you informed and kept you thinking about what you should be doing and where you should be going, and the importance of that for informing our work on GCRs. Stacey and her team have been working on education and outreach campaigns for over 10 years in the Caribbean region. And certainly many campaigns that they've done, including the Volcano Ready program, which was specifically about preparing communities for the eruption, have just they've proved their worth in increasing the resilience of communities for this exact outcome. Not a single person died in that eruption, and it's incredible. So just the importance of education and outreach just can't be overstated. The biggest and hardest lesson for me is no matter what you do, you just won't reach everyone. And we're talking about a small island of 100,000, and we definitely weren't able to reach anyone. When you speak to someone and you say, do you have a radio? No. Do you have a phone? No. Do you have a TV? No. How do you reach that person? Knocking door to door and going into communities directly. But now apply that to the world. That's the audience we're trying to communicate in GCRs and existential risk. We're trying to communicate certain messages to an awful lot of people. And you just have to accept that we won't be able to reach everyone. But what are the mechanisms and things that we can do to do that? And so what we saw in St Vincent is the role of the Red Cross and humanitarian organisations in communities and villages, and the importance of getting the flow of information and messages into communities. And so perhaps global catastrophic risks and existential risks should think about teaming up much more with humanitarian organisations such as the Red Cross, and we're really lucky to have a few of the Red Cross joining us this week. Expect the unexpected. I mean, that seems pretty obvious. But this one, in all of the years we've ever thought of an eruption in this region, we never thought a global pandemic would happen at the same time. It had some advantages, it had some disadvantages, but this is where scenarios can come in, and it can help us thinking about this a little bit more and try to identify these kind of I don't want to use black swan because I hate that term, but yeah, these are kind of more unexpected events that we perhaps can help build our resilience and preparation. So I've rambled on for quite a long time now. I'm just going to bring it back to my conclusions, which are that we need to adopt theories of change when we're developing communications and outreach to ensure what we do works. So always thinking about impact when you're designing your communications. Communicating about GCRs can be extremely difficult to navigate, but we should use the right dosing of fear. Some fears can be quite good, but obviously some fear is not good. A lot of fear is not great. Not everyone needs to know about global catastrophic risks, and it's really important to understand your audience. We can draw from real-time crises to inform our work on GCRs, and creative communication methods like scenarios, arts, humour, gaming can all be really effective at increasing resilience. And I didn't want to end there. I wanted to kind of set an agenda for this field because this is something I've been thinking about for a few years, but many more people need to think about this too. And so what do I think we need to be doing from here? Risk perceptions. We need to understand how people think and feel about global catastrophic risks and existential risks so we can inform our communications. We need to do greater message testing. There's some early signs of message testing from organisations like CLTR and FLI. We need to keep working on this. What's the effective languages? How can we pitch? What is the content that we need to be using to make sure that the messages we're doing work well? We need a greater adoption of creative communication methods. And I'm super excited to have Pablo come and spend some time with us later this year to try and start thinking about this. But we need much more effort in this area. Education outreach programs are essential. How can we get GCRs onto national curriculums? How can we get it into the mainstream? How can we get people talking about these risks? An evidence-based communication must lead. We must be doing communications that work and know that we know work well. We may only get that chance once. So that's where I'll leave it. Okay, thanks.
Just bear with us 1 second. I'm just getting the mic for Q&A. Thanks, Lara. And now to question and answer. And we've had some great questions coming in already on Discord. To be very clear to understand ones. So good communicators speaking to you this morning. And I'm going to go through a number of those, and then Shahar, can I ask you just to look out for questions in the room, and if you put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll come to those after a couple of these. I'm just pressed this. So RS, who on Discord, I'm not going to guess who their real name is, but I can guess, says thanks, Lara, and there's been lots of chat about it being a great talk, very clearly communicated. But they sometimes wonder about whether there is, within the X-risk world, the very binary narrative split along the lines of, if we get through this century, we can have many centuries of beauty and flourishing afterwards. And the idea that between that kind of horror and then flourishing, we see a binary difference is what I'm reading into RS's point. But from a communications perspective, it's very stark. Any thoughts on this? How do we nuance this kind of binary way of I guess, moving between the extremes of existential risk and unhope and existential hope?
Excellent question. How do I think we do that? I don't think there's a one solution. This is something that I think we also need to reflect on a little bit in this field, is how far into the future should we be communicating? What is the kind of, when we're talking about long term, what is that long term? Is it 10 years? Is it 20? Is it 50? Is it a century? Is it grand futures into different centuries? So I think that's where the first reflection needs to come, in understanding how to kind of do that. Yeah, I don't really know how to answer that one, if I'm honest with you, because it's quite a tricky one. I think all that we need to be doing is doing message testing. We need to be working out how people think about the risks and understanding how you can tailor messages to do that. And I think that's all I can really suggest for now, is until we understand the way in which people think about risks, it's very difficult to then start developing messages for even that kind of switch and jump.
And a related question from David Wood, what are some of the best examples of messages around existential hope? Maybe that's slightly easier to answer.
It's a bit of I love some of the work that FLI is doing. I think they're doing some wonderful stuff on a few bits and bobs. Yeah, I guess there's still not loads coming through on the existential hope side. I think we still relatively focus on the negative, and I would like to see much more on the positive spin. I think some of the stuff that we do here in CSER is pretty good. Some of the work that Shahar's done on, AI and those kind of bits and bobs. But I mean, I'm not sure I can come up with a concrete example.
It sounds like you're setting up a research agenda for the future, though,
wow.
Which is useful. And Matthew Rendell, who we met, asked, and this is maybe a little bit of a leading question. Would a class in school that taught kids to avoid basic logical fallacies, including fallacies of risk, make for a more rational public discourse? Can you connect that kind of education to it? I look at our colleagues from the Centre for Risk Communication who probably have an answer to this as well.
And totally feel free to kind of jump in. Well, I think it is important though. So there's this within disaster risk, why children are so important, and why I focused a lot of my attention in my PhD and things on children, is there's this concept that if you educate children, you can educate adults. They go home and they tell their parents about what they learn in school. And so children are super important. But also, I think we need to be raising generations, then their world is changing. It's a technologically advanced world. And we need to be teaching them how to navigate that too. So teaching them things like critical thinking and thinking about how to critically assess information and info hazards and things like that come their way, I think is also really important. So yeah, I definitely think that we should be thinking and adapting our curriculums to match the way in which we're kind of developing the communication side. Yeah, I think so. Do you want to add anything?
So I just one more question, and then we'll go to the ones in the room. And this is from Matt Boyd, who talks a lot about similar work he's done in human factors training. But he talks particularly about difficult senior stakeholders when you're doing scenarios work. So people who think they've seen it all and know it all from previous experience, and they do have serious previous experience. How, when you're doing scenario learning for very senior people who think they know it all, what is your experience of that, and what have you done to overcome some of that stubbornness?
So I'd say I haven't got that much experience of practice of scenarios. I'm more interested in understanding their impacts. But we all know those people, right? There's always those people that are difficult to overcome. And I think that's why scenarios and experiential learning work well, is because you can show them. And let's be honest, like scenarios have proved, we did scenario planning before COVID. There was 2016, we did the Operation Cygnus here in the UK that came out with a bunch of recommendations that would have made our response to this pandemic much better. But they weren't listened to. And that's because you get people that think that they know it all and think that everything's fine, or they just ignore those kind of warnings and symptoms. And so I think this is where you get like the power of in numbers, when you can have people that, within if you balance the way in which you approach these exercises, that you have people from different disciplines and backgrounds and different, a range of diversity. It can make those people, those old pieces of furniture in the room, feel like, they can understand the evolution of thinking when they're surrounded by diversity of thinking. So that would be what I would attempt to do. But yeah, I think that's something we should probably make sure we reflect on a bit with our scenarios work too.
Nice, thank you. Okay. Coming thick and fast. There's at least 3 questions. Maybe we take these 2 together and then come over here. Sorry.
Hey, this is Elias from the Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance. My question is on the history of wargaming in scenarios. How have the methods changed? I think it's been done already for like 20 years also in the States. Claydex is really just one more in the series. How have we become better at doing these kind of things?
Okay. I can't say I've done a literature review on wargaming, but I would say that we, when we did the scenarios workshop, I think we were all kind of a bit blown away by Centre for Health Security telling us that it was $1 billion experience. Sorry, million. Sorry, yeah, I wish it was $1 billion. $1 million experience. I mean, that's crazy funding. It's magic. And it just, the grandeur of it, I think, is quite marvelous. Like, they do lots of intensive filming. They have actors come into the, it's a production. And the point is about developing the realism and developing that kind of environment where you can put people that then make them kind of realize that. And I think, with advancements in the way in which we've done that and the funding that's going into scenarios, I think is helping with that. But there's much more evolution to do. I still think we can still do more. This is what it's saying. You can, so, Event 201, which was, that one that everyone felt was like, oh, did they release COVID? It happened just before COVID. Centre for Health Security did it in I think, November, December before COVID. And it had a whole range of recommendations about how to prepare for that pandemic. And, nothing was acted upon. Same with Operation Cygnus here in the UK. So it's one thing about doing them successfully, but it's then how do we get all of those recommendations and thoughts at the back end actually into action, getting people to do something about it. And this is where the work on policy and governance, the people, Crises is going to reflect hopefully a little bit on that tomorrow with some of the other colleagues, and making sure that we can get that translation. So I think the exercises themselves, I mean, you can do fairly basic scenario exercises and still have a similar impact if you can get the messages taken seriously.
One, and then we'll come to Angela.
Hey, Aaron Tang, Climate Policy PhD at the Australian National University. So then the climate and the science communication literature, there's an often criticized concept of the knowledge deficit model, right? Where there's an assumption that you just need to tell people or policymakers what the knowledge is, and the assumption there, which is often criticized, is that they'll just follow through. And in climate, for instance, long history of just talking about the science, don't get anywhere. Recent changes to talk more about alternate frames like energy independence or rural redevelopment instead of like climate change. So for catastrophic risks, have you come across or seen other alternate framings that could be more potentially broadly effective or effective for specific audiences other than just catastrophic risk?
So this is where I think that, and yeah, I didn't get to talk about this much today, but I think is where we actually need to change the way in which we communicate. Communication should never be a one-way road. They should always be a two-way dialogue. And so how can we bring in the people that we're communicating to develop the messages? How can we do co-creation and participatory methods to kind of make those messages stronger and better? And that's what I think is more important than necessarily reframing the message. I think it's more around that. And that's certainly what we've tried to do with a bit of the crisis communications in St. Vincent. And that's what our kind of film is that we're releasing later this week. It's people telling their stories by them. So yeah, kind of thinking more around that, which I think is really, it can be quite challenging to do. Especially when you have risks that the audience is everyone, in making sure that you get the diversity of voice that you're putting into the development of those messages too.
Thank you. Shahar, there was one question in the front row just before you.
Thank you, Lara. I thought this was Angela Kane. This is a really interesting presentation. And what I found interesting is because you're basically starting at the global level, and you're starting with something very negative, which was the Doomsday Clock. And and then you talk about, we need to have messages that kind of evoke emotions and that basically make you a participant, etc. And then you come to the COVID lessons, and then the St. Vincent catastrophic risk of the volcano. What I'm wondering, and you didn't mention that at all, but I think it's really, really powerful, is virtual reality. That was missing from your mix. And I think anyone who has seen a virtual reality film feels that's an emotional response that you have because basically you're a participant. But what I didn't see is like, you also say messages of hope, messages of empowering. And when you come to the Doomsday Clock, how do you give people agency? How do you give a positive message that actually makes them involved and wants them to make change? Because that is something that is a very hard bridge to cross. I mean, how do you get there? That's one of the difficulties that I have with it. I mean, you can use some lessons learned, but there aren't that many lessons learned that are positive. And that's the problem in this particular case.
I think that's my main critique of the Doomsday Clock and the Bulletin, is that in all of that, they don't know what the impact is of any of that. Yeah, you might have this amazing reach to 35 million people, but is somebody looking at that clock and saying, oh my God, we need to take action and we need to develop policies and put things in motion to make the change? And the answer is no. And, that's what needs to be happening more. And that's why I think I'm on my high horse about doing, impactful communication, because in all honesty, the only way that you can also stay relevant is if you're having that impactful change. So it kind of, 75 years that clock and that bulletin have remained there, have remained present, they're developing these messages, but I can't see any evidence of what it actually does. And so that is what I think my main critique is for now. And I think there is small examples. They had a really good one on an article in the Bulletin for COVID, which I think was quite impactful. And then, on the second part about developing these kind of messages for hope and change and examples of those, I agree. And that's because we have this blinkered thing, is that so whenever you get people to come up with future imaginaries, they'll often go to the dystopian rather than the utopian. They'll often go towards pessimism rather than optimism. And so FLI has been doing some wonderful stuff with their world building contest around developing aspirational futures and thinking about how to develop those messages and getting this kind of content out as well. And I think it has to be a conscious decision that we start looking for those hopeful messages and those positive things. And certainly that's in some of the background of the nudge unit within the British government, the behavioural insights team, is around taking the positive messages during the pandemic. So Captain Tom Moore and his wonderful fundraising, that had amazing central focus because it was something that gave hope and gave, showed everybody that we were in this together and developing that community kind of feel. So, but that's what we now need to be doing also for global catastrophic risk. We need to be looking for these things and pulling them from places like COVID and from other disasters around the world and starting to to put those together to build the right messaging. Yeah, we're not there yet.
Thank you. There was one question in the middle row up there, and then maybe we could go to Luke afterwards.
So many thanks, Thomas Meyer from the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies in Heidelberg, Germany. In the first part of your talk, you were mentioning that probably not everybody needs every information, and you had that point in the conclusions as well, if I got you right. This is especially when it comes to mitigation and long-term developing risks and catastrophes, not at the immediate impact. This idea struck me in several ways, and I'm asking on the background that we are living in times of postmodernity and postcolonialism, with empowering, questioning top-down processes, sitting power in groups and individuals, and so on. And so there are three things that struck me. The one is practical: who decides? Who will get what kind of information, and who is responsible for not information? The second one is political. You mentioned that you are working together with elite stakeholder groups. How can you ensure that these groups really have the power to do things, or really have the power to change things in what we see in current developments of democracy? And the third one is more ethical. How does this go together if power equals knowledge, or knowledge equals power, if you retain information from certain parts of the population in a democratic society?
Well, so I think that comes to the transparency thing, is like you might target messages for each other, for different audiences, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to have them visible. So like, you know, a lot of, I think this is even just within academia, we publish open access, or we should be publishing open access, because, you know, everybody should have access to information equally. And so I would say that it's not about retaining information from certain people, it's about targeting in a language, in a way that speaks to the person that you're talking to. So yeah, it's not about, you can't listen to this because you're the public and this is only going to go through private forums. It's not like that. That's not what I think is the case at all, and that's where transparency has to be paramount. The second was, just remind me, around power and understanding if you're speaking to the right people in power. An excellent question. And so, I mean, we can only do so much, right? So with the Par-Evo exercise that we did, that one, for example, was academics, people within governance, and are already within that kind of field, but those that we also have access to, right? We perhaps don't always have access to the right people. But then during our scenarios workshop, we heard from Eric Toner at the Centre for Health Security, who said, you know, just through word of mouth and just through cold calling, we managed to get people in the White House to turn up. So, yeah, I agree. It's difficult to make sure that you're going to cover all those bases. And I guess some of the ways to think about that is just making sure you're doing multiple approaches, and so if you're doing scenario exercises, not just doing one and hoping that that's going to work, but do it with many people, do replicability, and trying to get that through kind of grand audiences is the way I kind of say. But and then the third point, can you remind me, was?
The third one was about the ethics of information and democracy.
Yeah, of course. Like, I don't think, that kind of on the first reflection that I kind of had about making sure it's transparent and making sure that I mean, this is one of the problems, I think, is in some of these, particularly in crisis situations, is withholding information leads to greater chaos later, Partygate, right? And we're all angry about that now because, of course, that was withheld information. So, I think it kind of comes back to the same thing about transparency of information.
Last question in the room from Luke.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think the one thing that was lacking in terms of creativity was memes. But, oh well, I can't win them all. So this may be a left-field question, so forgive me in advance. You spoke, I think, implicitly from kind of almost consequentialist view of, how can we maximize impact? How can we have the best consequences possible? Do you think there are many duties that we should follow? And you've actually thought about that in terms of the duties we have as scholars when communicating. And I guess a related question is, how do we ensure, since with great impact comes great responsibility, to paraphrase Spider-Man, actually Uncle Ben, that when we're communicating, we don't actually have or do great damage and harm.
Yeah, it's a challenge on the second one for sure. And this is where I think you have the kind of use of trusted voices, but also that. So what I'm very keen for in the way that we're going to approach, communications going forward in this field is that it's not just us at CSER doing communications about global catastrophic risk. It must be the community. It must be the field of existential risk and global catastrophic risk combining on this, and people that want to talk about these things, and people that are from a wide range of different backgrounds and diversities. We must do it like that. And I think that's it's not easy, right? There's we're all scattered across the world. You'll have different ways of thinking, different ideals. How do you kind of bring these together into salient points? And I think that's where this field needs to combine much more and have discussions about what we think is important and how we want to kind of frame those messages and things like that. And this is some kind of reflections because we've chatted about doing all sorts of things like documentaries and things like this, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done in making sure we even understand how to talk about what our science is at all. And I think that's a major challenge in academia that a lot of people struggle with is understanding how to talk about their science, one, but also understanding what the impact of that science is. And so when you're communicating, like we're saying, there's potentials of harm too, but also understanding how it fits into that real world picture and how it has relevance into people's lives. And so I think we're far from this still, because it's such a nascent field, and I think we're still fighting with understanding some of the risks, and we're like, bringing in all these different minds and different fields, and working out how to communicate with each other, and working out how to put all this together. And I still think we're far from that. But yeah, it has to be considered that we have to this kind of aspect of potentially doing harm, and it does happen, right? Sometimes. In fact, one example of that is during the evacuations of St. Vincent, one of the MPs, as they were evacuating people to the boats, was yelling, "Oh, you're all going to get vaccinated when you get to shelters," which, of course, people turned around and went back to their homes. So, thinking about, it was not true. They didn't vaccinate people, but, so you certainly can do harm.
That's fascinating, and thank you so much for telling us about those lessons from the wider range of risk communication for our catastrophic risk conversations. We now have half an hour coffee break. I would encourage those on Discord to use the thread associated with Lara's talk, where Lara will be looking later and continue the conversation. There are 4 places left at Lara's workshop, so if you run quickly, you can probably sign up at the reception desk. And we'll continue this discussion at 11:45. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.